this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to actually find an apartment here in Paris without getting scammed. The housing market here in Paris is extremely competitive, and there are tons of scammers out there just waiting to take advantage of people who are moving into the city. I have now successfully rented 3 apartments here in France as a foreigner and have had to dodge and navigate my way through multiple scams and bad landlords. So I'm here to share my experience with you and break down the process of renting an apartment here in Paris, and then give you some tips and tricks that you can follow to make sure that you don't get scammed. Don't start searching for an apartment until you're actually in Paris. Most people think that the earlier you start your search, the better, because you have more options and you're more prepared, but it doesn't really work like that here. There are a ton of apartments in Paris, but there are equally just as many people fighting for those apartments here, and so apartments here go very quickly. And the people that you're competing with for these apartments are usually ready to move in right away. Don't start looking for an apartment here until you're actually in the city and actually ready to move, because if you see an apartment that you really like and you contact the landlord about it, but you're not in the city yet to even look at this apartment or make a move on this apartment, chances are they're not going to respond to you. They're going to go to the next person who's actually in the city and actually ready to move in now. First, decide if you want to use an agency to find your apartment or if you want to try to find an apartment all on your own. There's definitely pros and cons to both options. I know lots of people who have found their apartments on their own, and I know a lot of people who have found an apartment through an agency. Both work well. This is totally up to you and what you're looking for. There are a lot of scams in the Paris housing market, unfortunately, and a lot of bad landlords who take advantage of foreigners who don't know the law as well or how things work here. So to avoid getting scammed, it is a good idea to consider using an agency to find your apartment. These agencies usually have a good relationship with the landlords, and they're able to kind of be the middleman between everything, and it's a really good option if you're just moving here and you don't really know how the market here works or don't speak French very well. It's a good option to just hire an agency to take care of everything for you. However, agencies do charge a fee, and they can be a bit expensive, so that is something to keep in mind as well. Most agencies here in Paris will charge you a fee of around 200 to 300 euro. It can sometimes be more than that, and this is a fee that will be due on top of your other charges when you first move into this apartment after you sign the lease. So usually if an agency helps you find an apartment, you'll sign the lease, you'll pay the deposit, first month's rent, and you'll pay the agency fee all at move-in. So that is something to keep in mind if you do opt for an agency. Before you start your search, you need to know what kind of apartment you want to have. Think about things like the size of the apartment. So in Paris, we have a few different types of apartments. We have studio apartments, T1, T2, T3, so on. Studio apartment is going to be exactly that, your basic studio apartment. You have usually a kitchenette, the bed, a little desk, everything in one area. There's no room separation. A T1 is going to be something very similar. It's a 1-bedroom area. Usually it's just a little bit bigger than a studio. A T2 sounds like a 2-bedroom apartment, but it's actually a 1-bedroom apartment with a living room. So it's 2 rooms technically, but one of the rooms is the living room and the other room is the bedroom. So it's a 1-bedroom apartment. T3 would be the same thing, 2 bedrooms and then 1 living room, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Know the area of the apartment. So apartments here are measured in meters squared. 9 meters squared is the absolute minimum by law that landlords in Paris can rent to you, which is extremely small. But if you're on a budget and you don't care about the size, 9 meters squared is the absolute minimum legally that they can rent to you, and it goes up from there. So obviously the higher the amount of square meters you have, the more expensive it'll be. But that is just something to keep in mind. That's usually the first thing I check when I see an apartment listing. I look at the price and then I look at the size to make sure that it is accurate pricing and a good enough size for me. Next, think about the location. So we need to find out, what neighborhood do you want to be in? If you're taking transportation, what are the closest metro stops or bus stops? Is it a quiet area? Is it a lively area with lots of nightlife? Is it safe? Is it not safe? What kinds of stores and attractions are in the area? Next, of course, you're going to consider the price. So not only do you want to look at the price of rent every month, you want to make sure you know what's included in that amount. So be sure to check through the listing and see if it notes what extra costs you'll be paying every month, like water, electricity, Wi-Fi, gas, Usually that stuff is not included in the rent, so it is important to be aware of that as well. And then of course, how much is the deposit? So when you move in, generally every apartment is going to ask you for a deposit. This is usually the amount of 1 month's rent, but some places can charge you more than that. I've had some apartments who charge 2 months worth of rent for a deposit, so it can get quite expensive, but of course you get this back at the end of your lease if you don't have any damages in the apartment. But that is something to think about as well, because you will have to have that amount in the beginning when you sign your lease. Next, decide what amenities are important to you. So before you even start looking for apartments and you're in the process of brainstorming what kind of apartment you want, think about what kind of amenities you want your apartment to have. Is it important for you to have a balcony? Is it important for you to be on the ground floor, or do you want to be on a high level? Do you need to have a washer and dryer? Think about these things and kind of jot them down so that when you're looking for an apartment, you can easily filter through and skip straight to the apartments with all the amenities that you want. It's also important to consider whether your apartment is furnished or unfurnished. Generally, unfurnished apartments are a little bit less expensive every month, but you do have to consider the fact that you will have to pay to furnish the apartment. If you're coming from a new country and you have absolutely no furniture and you just want to move in and not have to deal with it, then look for a furnished apartment. So next it is time to get your documents in order. My dear France is a country that loves paperwork. There is always a ton of paperwork required to do pretty much anything here. So there definitely are a few documents that you will need when you are trying to rent an apartment. You will need your passport, your visa if you're not a European citizen, a copy of your school registration if you're a student, an employment contract or an offer letter for employment. Usually if you have a job here in France, they're going to want to know if you have a CDD or a CDI. So a CDD is a contract for a determined amount of time. So it could be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, whatever. And then a CDI is an indefinite contract. So basically your standard job where you get hired and you don't have a definitive end date. So you have either a CDD or CDI. You're also going to need your bank statements for the last 3 months to show that you make enough money to cover the rent. A letter from your current landlord if you have one. A lot of times they will ask you for a quittance de loyer. This is like a receipt from your landlord that says that you paid rent on time every month. So it'll say the amount that you paid and the date that you paid. So if you have a current landlord now, they should be sending you these every month. And when you go to look at apartments, you're going to want to have your previous 3 quittances de loyer in your dossier, because they're going to want to see that you're paying your rent on time every month currently. And then some landlords will require you to have a guarantor, and usually they want this person to be French or at minimum in France. So a guarantor is someone who is responsible to pay rent for you in the event that you're unable to pay it. It's like a co-signer in America. So usually they want this person to be French, but sometimes you can get away with it if this person is living and working in France. And what they're going to want is pretty much the same thing from this person. They're going to want to see their last 3 pay stubs to make sure that they make enough money to pay the rent in the event that you can't pay it or you decide not to pay it. And usually they want to see that this person makes at least 3 times the rent. There are some other options for foreigners who don't have a guarantor in France or don't know someone who can be their guarantor, and it is funded by the government. It's called the Garant Fiscal. I will leave the link up here and in the description box below. It's super easy to fill out. If you don't have a guarantor here in France, you can opt for the Garant Fiscal option, but keep in mind that there are a lot of landlords here that don't accept that. So it's kind of hit or miss. You'll have to figure out if the apartment that you are looking for will accept it or not. I can't stress enough how essential it is to have all these documents together before you start your search, because at every place that you visit, right away the landlords will ask you for your dossier or your folder of all these documents, and if you don't have it, they're not even going to consider you. And because these apartments are so competitive, if you don't have the documents that they need, they're going to just move on to the next person, and more than likely that person's going to get the apartment straight away because they had all their documents together. So I wouldn't even recommend starting your search until you have all these documents compiled. So like I said, when you're ready to search for an apartment, when you know what kind of apartment you want, you've done your research, you have all your documents together, now it's time to start looking for an apartment. But Where do I go? How do I find an apartment? So you're going to decide if you want to use an agency or if you want to find an apartment on your own. If you're planning to use an agency here in Paris, there's plenty of agencies you can choose from. You can literally walk down the street and see at least 4 real estate agencies on the same street. There's tons of them around here. You won't miss them. Literally just walk into the agency, look through their listings, see if you find something you like. You can also scroll through online offers for apartments, and sometimes agencies will list their apartment offers online as well. Usually you can see on the listing whether it was posted by the landlord themselves or if it's represented by an agency. If you're looking for an apartment on your own and not going through an agency, there are a few places where you can look. So Le Bon Coin is a very popular place to look for apartments. This is where I found my current apartment. Le Bon Coin is kind of like a French version of Craigslist. So there are tons of things for sale. There's rooms for rent. If you don't want a whole apartment, you can find just a room. There's apartments for rent, apartments to sublease, etc. Just do be advised that there are a lot of scams on here, so just be vigilant. Use common sense. Don't send money to anyone without having anything signed, without seeing the apartment. But there are usually tons of offers for apartments that you can find on Le Bon Coin. After that, there is Apartager. This is another website where you can scroll through apartment listings. You also have Se Loger, and Jinka is a really good app. This one I prefer the most. All you do is make an account on the app. You list your preferences that you want in an apartment, so you can put the max rent that you want to pay, the size that you want, how many bedrooms, if you want a balcony, if you need a washer, dryer, etc. And then anytime an apartment is listed anywhere online in the area that matches your preferences, it notifies you in the app. I really like this because you can just scroll through one app and see listings from all over the internet instead of having to go through 5-10 different sites looking through apartments. There are some other websites here that I have had some friends use to find apartments as well. I don't necessarily recommend them because they are targeted more towards foreigners, so they tend to raise the prices a little higher than they should be and a little higher than they would be if they were renting to French locals. But it is an option if you have the money and you don't want to be bothered to go through the search process. So those apartments are called Paris Stay and Paris Attitude. Facebook groups are also a really great option to find apartments here as well. There are tons of Facebook groups that you can use to find housing here. Literally just search apartments in Paris, rooms for rent in Paris, appartement à Paris. You can find tons of groups that are made for renting apartments and finding roommates. Also, if you're in groups like expats in Paris or Americans in Paris, anything like that, you can always post in those as well. And there's always people willing to help you out, point you in the right direction, or maybe give you recommendations if they know of anyone renting an apartment. So you can definitely find an apartment either way. No matter what you decide, you can definitely find an apartment. Just keep in mind that a lot of landlords prefer to work with agencies because they know that the agencies will do most of the work in screening the tenants and making sure that they're qualified for the apartment, and so they tend to work with agencies a lot more. But like I said before, not every landlord works with an agency. I've found 2 apartments now on my own and didn't have to go through an agency, so it's definitely possible. So once you put all your preferences in, you filtered through all the apartments and you found some that you like, you're going to want to message the landlords. So in your message, you are going to give them a brief description about you, tell them your status, whether you're working, whether you're a student, basically what you're doing here in Paris. You're going to want to tell them what kind of work contract you have. So if you're salaried, if you're an intern, etc. You're going to want to tell them when you want to move. Like I said earlier, it's preferred if you want to move as soon as possible or within the next 2 weeks. You're going to tell them your desired lease duration if it's not already stated in the listing. And then you're going to ask when you can view the apartment and leave your contact info so that they can contact you back. So you're going to want to give them as much information up front as possible and answer any questions that you think they could potentially have for you in the beginning, because more than likely they're going to have tons and tons of responses to their listing. And so they're naturally going to gravitate towards someone who's answering all their questions up front and someone that they don't have to go back and forth with to get information out of. So it's best to just tell them everything up front, and then if they're interested, they can contact you back and you can set up a time to see the apartment. So I visited an apartment that I liked and I want to rent it. What's next? So when you find an apartment that you like and you are ready to sign, the landlord's going to draft up a lease agreement, and then he's going to ask you to sign it and then pay the deposit. Like I said before, the deposit is typically 1 month's rent, but it can be a lot more depending on the price of the apartment, depending on the landlord, lots of things. So be prepared to pay this deposit because this is what's going to secure your spot in the apartment. This is why I say it's so important to have your documents and your deposit ready before you even start looking for an apartment, because it would really suck if you spent all your time looking for an apartment, you found the perfect one, you were ready to sign, and then you find out that you have to pay your deposit right away when you move and you're not ready, you don't have the money, whatever. That would be just a waste of your time, the waste of the landlord's time. So just avoid that. Don't even start your search until you have your deposit ready, because you will have to pay it as soon as you see an apartment that you like and you're ready to sign the lease and you want to hold the apartment. And of course, your landlord will hold the deposit from you for the duration of your entire lease, and you will get it back at the end of the lease, minus any damages that you may have done in the apartment when you move out. Never pay the deposit without signing the lease first, you guys. There are tons and tons of scams on listings here in Paris that say, you know, I just had so many responses to this listing, and if you want to hold this apartment, you have to send me 500 euro, 300 euro to hold the apartment, just because I spent so much time traveling back and forth to show the apartment, and if you're serious, you need to send this money to hold the apartment. No, it's a scam. Don't do it. Don't send any money to anyone that you've never met. Even if you've met them, you've seen the apartment, and you don't have anything signed, do not send the deposit until you have a lease signed stating that you're paying whatever amount for the deposit and that you're going to be staying in that apartment from this time to this time. Until you have a lease signed, do not send any money. It can be tempting. I know it's very stressful finding an apartment, and that's what they feed off of. They know that you're nervous. They know that you're scared to lose this apartment. Maybe it's the apartment of your dreams and you're scared that someone else is going to take it. And that can be tempting to want to send them money to hold that apartment for you, but it's not worth the risk at all. There are so many apartments here in Paris. Even if you think you're not going to find one or you lost the apartment of your dreams, there will always be another one. It's not worth the risk to lose out on hundreds of euros, literally thousands of euros. The deposits are not cheap. So do not send any money until you have a lease signed. So now it's time to sign the lease. It's important that you read through the lease carefully when you're signing it, because this is binding and you're going to have to follow everything that's written in the lease. Some things that you should pay attention to in the lease: the length of the lease, the amount of rent that you will be paying. Usually in the lease, it'll say what's included in the rent. So if you're paying 1,000 euros per month rent, it should also say whether this is just rent, whether this includes electricity, gas, Wi-Fi, anything that you're required to pay. It should be detailed in the lease. It should also say when the rent is due. Usually they'll say it's due on this date, and if it's not paid on this date or paid after this date, then there will be a late fee or whatever. It'll always specify what day the rent is due. Also, any rules about pets, smoking, sometimes rules about decorating the apartment, whether you're able to paint or hang things up or not. If you have any questions at all about the lease, be sure to ask the landlord before you sign it. If you're not fluent in French, it could be a good idea to have a translator help you, or to have a friend who's fluent or native in French to help you translate. It's to make sure that you're really understanding everything that's written in the lease before you sign it, so that you and the landlord are on the same page and there's no misunderstandings about anything. Once you sign the lease, you are legally obligated to follow it, and you are binded to everything that's stated in the lease. So it is super, super important to make sure that you know exactly what is in the lease and exactly what you're signing. Make sure you're comfortable with everything before you sign your name on that dotted line. Unfortunately, like I've said thousands of times in this video, there are tons of scams that happen when looking for apartments in Paris. There are a few scams that you need to be aware of so that it doesn't happen to you. Some landlords may take your money and then just never give you the keys to the apartment. This, I think, is very rare that this happens, but this is why it's important to sign the lease before you send any money, and to make sure that you have copies of the landlord's identification before you sign the lease, just to make sure that they are who they say they are and that they actually own the place or have the right to rent the place that they're showing you. Another scam that happens sometimes here in Paris is a landlord will show you an apartment or they'll list one apartment and then they'll do a bait and switch and they'll try to get you to sign a lease for a less desirable apartment or an apartment that is not at all what they were originally showing in the listing. So that is something to keep in mind as well. And other landlords will try to charge you extra fees. Maybe they know you're a foreigner or they know that you're not familiar with the Paris housing market, so they'll try to charge you for extra things that you shouldn't be charged for. So again, it is just really important to do extra research and just brush up on these common scams that happen when you're renting an apartment here. The best way to avoid getting scammed when looking for an apartment is to make sure you visit the apartment before you sign anything. Get everything in writing. Every time you communicate, get it in writing. I don't care if it's email, text message. Email is preferable, but even if it's text message, make sure all communication is in writing. Do not pay anything until you have signed the lease. Don't give your passport or ID information to anyone. That's another scam that's really common in Paris. You'll message someone about an apartment listing and they'll say, okay, can you send me a copy of your passport and your ID? Instantly, right away, that's a scam. No landlord is going to need that information right away in the first communication with them when they don't even know if they're going to rent this place to you. They're not going to ask you for that until it's time to sign the lease and they're actually ready to rent the apartment to you. So if someone says that to you right away, know it's a scam, stop communicating with them, move on to the next listing. Be wary of anyone who asks for money up front without seeing the apartment right away. If they ask you for money, it's a scam. Don't even engage. Move on. You'll find something better. If you do find yourself in a situation where you think you've been scammed, go to the police, give them all the documentation, tell them everything that happened. French police, especially in Paris, to be honest, they aren't very vigilant when it comes to things like this. I think stuff like this happens all the time that they're just so used to it and they have so much other things to worry about that they don't really tend to put these things as priority or get these things fixed. So it is a shame if this happens to you. This is why I stress how important it is to try your best to make sure that this doesn't happen to you and that you're not in this situation, because it is really hard to get your money back if this happens to you. Some final tips I have for you for renting an apartment here in Paris. Be prepared to spend a lot of money. The average amount for a one-bedroom apartment here in Paris is around 1,000 euros. Of course, you can pay way more. You can find some for a little bit less depending on the size, but on average, you're gonna pay around 1,000 euros if you're looking for a one-bedroom apartment. Know what your budget is before you start searching and stick to it. It can be very tempting to increase your budget little by little when you start to realize exactly how little options you have with the budget that you initially set. But it is really important to stick to your budget because you have to keep in mind that you're not just paying for rent, you're paying for rent, plus electricity, plus Wi-Fi, plus taxes, plus whatever else. So it really does add up. It's important to define a reasonable budget and really try to stick to that. It's important to make sure you also get renter's insurance. This is not legally required by law in France, but it is still a good idea to have. This just covers you in the event that someone breaks into your apartment and steals something, or there's a fire or a flood and your possessions are damaged. This covers you and your possessions for the entire time that you're staying in the apartment. And of course, get to know your neighbors. It's very common in France for people to be friendly with their neighbors and say hello. Make sure to be friendly and smile and say hello to your neighbors once you move in to make sure that you get off on the right foot and have a friendly living environment. So those are my tips for finding an apartment here in Paris. I really hope this is helpful for you guys. Just make sure you guys do your research, follow these tips, use common sense, and I'm sure you will find the apartment of your dreams here in Paris quickly and easily. As always, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to leave them down below. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next video.